listening to Colonial Resistance Fighters in the Internal French Resistance, Their Stories, a history podcast set during the Second World War, which tells the stories of members of the French internal resistance who came from French North Africa and fought against the German occupation of 1940 to 1944. In each episode, I focus on different resistance fighters, namely Mohamed Oulad Taleb, Antoine Meghzi, and brothers Hossein and Aleski Kawan. You'll hear about their backgrounds, their resistance activities, and their lives, using information gathered from their resistance files. The podcast explores how different aspects of their identities, such as their race, religion, and citizenship status, may have influenced their decision to resist and the nature of their resistance action. Thousands more colonial resistance fighters than this operated in France during World War II, but these podcasts aim to change the narrative about who resisted. They demonstrate that the history and memory of the French resistance is diverse and that colonial populations are a part of it. In this episode, we tell the story of Antoine Meghzi. Some background on this person. Antoine Meghzi was born in Paris on the 10th of July 1922. He was the son of a long-standing interracial couple, Mohan Ben Meghzi and Hortense Julie van der Creux. He also had a brother named Omar. The family lived in Cremlon-Bicêtre, a town in the southern suburbs of Paris. Later, they moved to 21 Rue de Montlhéry in Saint-Michel-sur-Orge, once again in the southern suburbs. His family makeup is very significant within this context for several reasons. Even though we don't know Antoine Meghzi's father's story of how he arrived in France, it suggests that he had established a long period of residence and connections in France from fairly early on. To dig deeper into this, in the first half of the 20th century, for example, there were several waves of migration of North Africans to France, predominantly for labour reasons. In 1912, there were 4,000 or 5,000 Algerians employed in France to correspond to the great industrial needs of the time. Then, from 1915 to 1918, this grew to over 132,000 North Africans in France who were brought as conscripted labour to work in factories during the First World War, and by the outbreak of the Second World War, there were more than 500,000 colonial workers. Throughout, of course, some returned home, but nevertheless, Meghzi's family unit clearly demonstrates that colonial migrants were settling in France in greater numbers than we often perceive, and they were integrating and establishing lives. It is often considered that North Africans had a transitory relationship to France, so the idea that they would come to earn money, send it back to their families, and when they could, return home. But Meghzi's birth in 1922 points to the fact that his father had settled in France. This is very important for our understanding of the immigration story of North Africans in France, and labour is just a part of this story. North Africans were establishing rich social and family lives, and France was a multicultural nation that North Africans were contributing to. They were not simply workers in this society, and so we need to mention that when we talk about this subject. Additionally, Antoine Meghzi was a full French citizen. In cases of North Africans who were born in the different colonial territories, they were only French subjects, not French citizens. They had French nationality, but not French citizenship. This aspect of his identity is important in understanding the nature of his later resistance action. He grew up in France and would have had French education and training. Do you think that this would have influenced his reasons for resisting and the nature of his resistance? Would he have felt connected to France, perhaps due to his identity? Did patriotism play a part in his actions? We will discuss this a bit more later. However, at the same time, Meghzi would have still been an other in his society. Despite his citizenship, there still would have been social, cultural, and linguistic differences for him to negotiate. Things like skin colour and religion would have meant he, like many others, was regarded as other by both the French collaborationist Vichy regime and the German occupying power. So, we have to consider how every aspect of his identity may have impacted his activity as a resistance fighter. Meghzi did an apprenticeship as a locksmith. However, following the apprenticeship, he found himself unemployed. and this is what makes him perfect for resistance action, or makes him a perfect target for it. Meghzi's resistance action begins with his decision to actively avoid the compulsory work service, known in French as the Service de Travail Obligatoire. For context, on the 16th of February 1943, all Frenchmen between 21 and 30 were required to register for civilian work in Germany in order to help the German war effort. Thus, many Frenchmen, including Antoine Meghzi, decided to become a réfractaire. There isn't really an English equivalent of this word, but essentially it refers to those who are trying to escape being drafted for this service. Réfractaires were not the same as active members of the French resistance. However, many réfractaires did in turn join resistance groups. And Meghzi is an example of this. On the 5th of September 1943, he joined the Francs-Tireurs et Partisans Français resistance organisation and carried out action in the southern sector of Paris. The FDPF, for short, was an armed organisation created by the leaders of the French Communist Party in April 1942. It was open to non-communists but did operate under communist control. The organisation undertook actions such as sabotage, assassinations, and punishing collaborators during the German occupation. Meghzi took the pseudonym Duru and acted as a liaison agent for a man named Victor Delannoy, the regional commissioner for the FDPF for the southern sector of Paris. Delannoy was responsible for housing people who refused to join the compulsory work service, which could explain how Meghzi and Delannoy came into contact, interestingly. Meghzi was involved in distributing tracts inciting resistance against the German occupying forces, as well as performing sabotages and armed attacks against the Germans himself. For example, it is documented that he took part in an attack at Place d'Italie with 5 or 6 others in January 1944. In fact, following this event, he was named a Master Corporal, Caporal-Chef in French, a rank above that of an ordinary soldier. This is important because we see that Antoine Meghzi had a significant amount of influence and impact on the work of this resistance organisation. He was working alongside others, high-ranking officials, and was even promoted within the organisation. Meghzi simply was not on the sidelines of the internal resistance. Antoine Meghzi's resistance activity ended on the 6th of February 1944, when he was arrested by the Brigade Spéciale, the Special Brigades, which was a police force during this period, specialising in tracking down internal enemies to the regime, such as resistance fighters, escaped prisoners, Jews, and people avoiding compulsory work service. He was imprisoned and then handed over to the Germans. He appeared in front of a German military tribunal on the 22nd of May 1944 and was then condemned to death. Antoine Meghzi was shot on the 2nd of June 1944, along with other members of the group, including Victor Delannoy. His execution took place at Mont-Valérien in Suresnes, in the western suburbs of Paris. Mont-Valérien was the main execution site in France, used by the German army during the Second World War. Executed there were resistance fighters, hostages, Jews, communists, and foreigners between March 1941 and August 1944. Mont-Valérien is one of the most well-known commemorative sites of the Second World War in France. Among those executed were 13 colonial resistance fighters, one being Antoine Meghzi. We are now going to discuss how Antoine Meghzi has been remembered and commemorated since his death. Initially, he was put in an unnamed mass grave in Ivry. This was a conscious act by the Germans to avoid it becoming a site of pilgrimage. However, on October the 7th, 1944, after the liberation of Paris, his body was returned to his family following their request. And he was granted the legal term of died for France in the immediate post-war years, one of only 6 of the 13 colonial resistance fighters who were shot at Mont-Valérien to receive the title at this point. This is an example of the fact that colonial resistance fighters struggled to receive state recognition equal to that of French and European fighters. It is likely that a large reason for Meghzi receiving a greater level of recognition so soon after the war as well is his family. How come? Unfortunately, most colonial resistance fighters were illiterate or semi-literate in French. This has made it more difficult to gain access to information on them and their voices since they did not leave letters of testimony. However, you will recall that Meghzi was born into a long-established interracial family, so it's likely that his French mother had the required literacy levels and understanding of the systems that were needed to get in contact with authorities to encourage this commemoration. And there is evidence of his commemoration taking place locally and nationally. In Saint-Michel-sur-Orge, for example, his name appears on the communal war memorial. A resident also requested that a street be named after Meghzi there, although in the end it was named Rue des Fusillés de la Résistance instead, in English, Street of the Executed of the Resistance. Overall, more information exists about Meghzi than many other colonial resistance fighters. Finally, earlier, we briefly discussed potential reasons why Meghzi was resisting. We asked ourselves, was it patriotism? Was it for France and her cause? In reality, it's incredibly difficult to answer this question because we can't ask him. We don't have all the information. Although, in Antoine Meghzi's case, we do have a copy of his final letter, which he wrote before he was executed. This is integral to our understanding of what he might have been fighting for. In the letter to his family, Meghzi writes, "I die for France. Like a soldier dies for his country. I hope that the country will show gratitude towards you." From this, it can be suggested that patriotism was a reason for his resistance action, and his connection to his French heritage was strong. In this episode, we have borne witness to the story of Antoine Meghzi, who died for France in 1944. His story is central to the history of the resistance. It is an example of the wide and extensive contribution of colonial populations to this cause all over Paris and all over France, something to be remembered. Written, told and produced by Eleanor Smith. For more stories of colonial resistance fighters in the French internal resistance, explore the other podcasts on this series, available on Spotify and YouTube.